Germany, 1922. An isolated farm. 6 people disappear into silence, and what police discover days later becomes one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in history. If you enjoy real investigations and dark true story, subscribe, like, and share. It helps the channel more than you think. Let's begin. Bavaria, Germany, 1922. Far from the nearest town, surrounded by fields and dense woodland, stood a small farm known as Hinterkaifeck. It was isolated even by rural standards. No close neighbors, no busy roads, just long stretches of land and silence that settled heavily after sunset. 6 people lived there. Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, their widowed daughter, Victoria, her 2 young children, and a new maid who had only recently arrived. Life at the farm followed a strict routine. Work began before sunrise, animals needed feeding, fields needed tending. Days were quiet, predictable, and physically demanding. But those who knew the family described the atmosphere as tense. Arguments were not uncommon. Rumors circulated in nearby villages, though few outsiders spent enough time there to understand what was true and what was gossip. The farm itself felt closed off from the world. Visitors rarely stopped by. And when they did, they usually didn't stay long. At night, the darkness around Hinterkaifeck was complete. No streetlights, no distant traffic, only wind moving through the trees and the sounds of the farm settling for the night. It was the kind of place where small things felt amplified. A noise carried farther. A shadow seemed longer. And silence could feel like someone listening. Nothing about the farm suggested that it would soon become the center of one of Germany's most unsettling unsolved cases. But in the days leading up to March 31st, that silence would begin to change. In the days before the murders, several unsettling details began to disturb the routine at Hinterkaifeck. What initially seemed like minor incidents slowly formed a pattern that would later feel impossible to ignore. Andreas Gruber told neighbors that he had discovered strange footprints in the snow near the farm. The tracks came from the direction of the forest and led directly toward the house, but there were no footprints showing anyone leaving again. For a remote farm where strangers rarely passed by, this was deeply unusual. At the same time, the family began hearing noises coming from the attic during the night. The sounds resembled slow footsteps or a movement above the living quarters, as if someone was walking carefully overhead while the household slept. When the noises were investigated, nothing was found and no clear explanation was given. Other strange events followed. Keys to the house reportedly went missing, raising concerns that someone might have had access to the farm without the family knowing. Even simple routines began to feel uncertain, as if the boundaries between inside and outside were no longer secure. Weeks earlier, a former maid had suddenly resigned, telling villagers that she believed the farm was haunted because of unexplained sounds and an atmosphere she found unbearable. At the time, her story was dismissed as superstition, but in hindsight, her departure would take on a darker meaning. Despite these warning signs, daily life continued. The animals were cared for, the work was done, and no one left the farm. Yet the sense of isolation that once defined Hinterkaifeck now felt different, as though someone unseen had already crossed into their world. By the end of March, the tension surrounding the farm had grown quietly but steadily, setting the stage for what would happen on the night of March 31st. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, life at Hinterkaifeck appeared to follow its usual routine. The family carried on with their work, unaware that the events of that night would soon turn the farm into one of Germany's most infamous crime scenes. At some point after nightfall, members of the household were drawn one by one into the barn. Investigators later believed that the killer used either familiarity or opportunity to separate the victims, preventing panic from spreading through the house. Inside the barn, 4 members of the family were attacked and killed with a mattock, a farming tool capable of causing devastating injuries in silence. The violence was deliberate and controlled. There were signs of struggle, suggesting that at least some of the victims fought desperately, but none were able to escape or alert the others inside the house. After the killings in the barn, the attacker entered the home itself. The maid, who had arrived only hours earlier, was killed in her room. The youngest child, 2-year-old Joseph, was found dead in his bed. By the time the violence ended, all 6 people living at Hinterkaifeck were dead. What made the crime especially disturbing was the apparent order in which it unfolded. The victims had not been killed in a chaotic outburst, but in a sequence that suggested planning and patience. The killer seemed to understand the layout of the farm and the routines of the people who lived there. For several days, however, no one realized what had happened. The farm remained quiet, its daily life seemingly continuing behind closed doors. Only when neighbors noticed that no smoke was rising from the chimney and the family had failed to appear in nearby villages did concern begin to grow. When they finally approached the property days later, they uncovered a scene that investigators would struggle to explain for decades, and the most disturbing discovery was still to come. When neighbors and visitors finally entered Hinterkaifeck days after the murders, they expected to find a tragedy frozen in time. Instead, they found something far more disturbing. Signs that life on the farm had continued after the killings. The bodies of 4 victims lay in the barn, partially covered with hay, as if someone had attempted to conceal them without truly hiding what had happened. Inside the house, the maid and the youngest child were found where they had been killed. The scene suggested that the murders had occurred several days earlier, yet the farm itself did not feel abandoned. The fire in the stove had been maintained. Neighbors later reported seeing smoke coming from the chimney during the days when the family was already dead, indicating that someone had kept the house warm and active. Food had been prepared and consumed. Fresh bread was cut. Meals appeared to have been eaten at the table. Even more unsettling, the animals in the barn had been fed and cared for. Cattle that would normally become restless or loud when neglected appeared calm and healthy, suggesting that someone had continued the daily routine of the farm after the murders took place. Investigators were forced to confront a possibility that defied common expectations of violent crime. The killer had not fled the scene. Instead, whoever committed the murders seemed to have remained on the property for days, moving through the same rooms where the victims lay dead only meters away. This detail transformed the case from a brutal killing into something psychologically far darker. Remaining at a crime scene requires confidence, patience, and a disturbing level of emotional detachment. The person responsible appeared comfortable enough to sleep, eat, and work in the presence of the bodies, suggesting either a deep familiarity with the farm or an extraordinary level of control. Some investigators believe the killer may have hidden in the attic before the murders, observing the family and learning their routines. The unexplained footsteps heard at night and the missing keys suddenly seemed less mysterious and more like warnings that had gone unrecognized. Others suggested the killer might have been someone known to the family, a person who could move around the property without immediately raising suspicion. The orderly nature of the killings and the continued care for the animals hinted at someone who understood farm life and felt no urgency to escape. For the nearby villagers, these details fueled rumors that spread quickly through the region. Some believed the killer must have been mentally unstable, while others suggested something supernatural, unable to accept that an ordinary person could calmly live among the dead. But the evidence pointed towards something far more human and far more unsettling. Someone had planned this, waited patiently, and then stayed long enough to ensure everything remained under control. By the time authorities arrived and secured the scene, the killer was gone. There were no clear tracks, no immediate suspects, and no explanation for why anyone would remain at a murder scene for 3 full days. That unanswered question became the defining mystery of Hinterkaifeck. Whoever committed the crime had not acted in panic or rage. They had acted with patience, and then with silence. And despite one of the largest investigations in the region at the time, the identity of that person would never be proven. In the days following the discovery of the bodies, authorities launched what became one of the largest investigations the region had seen at the time. Detectives, police officers, and forensic specialists arrived at Hinterkaifeck, attempting to piece together a crime that seemed both carefully planned and deeply irrational. From the beginning, the investigation faced serious challenges. By the time officials secured the farm, numerous neighbors, visitors, and curious onlookers had already entered the property, unintentionally disturbing potential evidence. Footprints, objects, and possible traces left by the killer may have been lost before investigators could properly document the scene. Over the following months, police questioned more than 100 suspects. Farm workers, local residents, former soldiers, and individuals connected to the family were all considered. Several theories emerged, but none could be proven beyond speculation. Some investigators believed the killer was someone known to the victims, someone familiar with farm life who understood the routines of the household and could move through the property without hesitation. Others suspected a personal conflict or a long-standing grievance that had escalated into violence. Yet no confession, credible witness, or physical evidence ever tied a single individual conclusively to the crime. In a sign of growing frustration, investigators even turned to unconventional methods. The skulls of the victims were reportedly sent to Munich, where clairvoyants were asked to assist in identifying the killer, a decision that reflected both the desperation surrounding the case and the limitations of forensic science at the time. Those remains would later be lost during the chaos of war, removing any chance of modern re-examination. As years passed, the farm itself was demolished, and the land eventually returned to quiet rural life. But the mystery never disappeared. The question that continued to trouble investigators and historians alike was not only who committed the murders, but why the killer chose to remain at the scene afterward. The footprints in the snow, the sounds from the attic, and the routine care of the animals all suggested patience rather than panic. Whoever was responsible may have been watching long before the violence began, waiting for the right moment to act. More than a century later, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain officially unsolved. No definitive suspect was ever named, and no final explanation satisfied all the evidence left behind. What remains is a quiet farm lost to history, and a question that still lingers in the shadows of the case. Was the killer a stranger who vanished into the forest, or someone who had already been inside the house all along?